In December of 2020, a festive atmosphere filled the Whitaker house, located on a quiet street in Hillsborough. Lisa had decorated the house with Christmas lights, while Emily helped her hang holiday ornaments. Jake was having fun wrapping presents that he intended to give to his family. The family seemed happy that evening, as always. But as it would later turn out, this day would be their last. The Whitaker home was a place where friends and neighbors loved to gather for parties and celebrations. The family was known for their warmth and hospitality. That evening, Lisa had baked traditional Christmas cookies, and their aroma filled the entire house. The children decorated the tree, while David, seemingly lost in his thoughts, occasionally smiled while sitting on the couch with his phone in hand. The family evening proceeded in its usual atmosphere. Lisa discussed plans for the next day, Jake shared his expectations about the presents, and Emily, as usual, argued with her younger brother. However, despite the apparent well-being, there was something tense in the air. Since returning from work on Friday, David had appeared withdrawn. Lisa noticed that he had begun spending more time alone in his office, speaking in short phrases, and, most uncharacteristically, avoiding interaction with the children. His gaze frequently lingered on his phone screen, and he spent long periods texting, deleting messages immediately after receiving them. Lisa, accustomed to his work-related stress, didn't give it much thought, though one evening she asked if everything was all right. David just nodded, assuring her that everything was fine. However, on that Christmas evening, his mood became even more depressed. Late in the evening, after the children had gone to bed, Lisa decided to finally talk to her husband. She approached him as he sat again with his phone in his hands. "David, what's going on?" she began quietly, so as not to wake the children. "You're not yourself at all. You've been like a stranger for several days now." David put down his phone, but his gaze remained fixed somewhere off to the side. "It's work. Problems with the project," he replied. "Everything will be sorted out tomorrow." "Tomorrow is Christmas," Lisa reminded him, but her husband merely nodded vaguely. When Lisa went to bed, she felt a strange unease that wouldn't leave her until morning. She couldn't have known that this would be their last conversation. Around midnight, the lights in the house went out, which neighbors said was unusual. The Christmas lights on the porch typically stayed on until morning. Mrs. Jennings, who lived across the street, mentioned to the police that around 1 o'clock in the morning, she heard muffled sounds that resembled pops. She thought they were fireworks, though she was surprised to hear them at such a late hour. That night, no one else saw or heard anything unusual. The Whitakers seemed to be resting peacefully in anticipation of the holiday. But the next morning, Hillsborough was shaken by horrific news that would forever change the life of their quiet neighborhood. What exactly happened in the house that night only became clear after police intervention. Christmas morning in Hillsborough began with silence, broken only by the sounds of arriving cars and the laughter of children playing outside. However, the Whitaker house looked unusual. Typically noisy and festive, on this day it seemed too quiet. Mrs. Jennings, their closest neighbor who always exchanged Christmas greetings with Lisa on the morning of December 25th, noticed the closed curtains and complete absence of movement. Hours passed, but no lights came on in the house, and no one came out to greet the neighbors. By mid-morning, Mrs. Jennings couldn't stand it anymore. She decided to stop by the Whitakers to give them a Christmas pie, as she did every year. After knocking on the door and receiving no answer, she first thought the family might have left. But she was troubled by the fact that both cars were in the driveway, and the decorations on the porch hadn't been turned on. She called Lisa, but her call went unanswered. After trying again, Mrs. Jennings felt growing concern. She knew Lisa always responded quickly. At this point, she decided to call the police. Patrol officers arrived at the Whitaker house around 10:30 in the morning. After examining the exterior perimeter, they found that the windows and doors were closed, with no signs of forced entry. However, through the kitchen window, one of the officers noticed something strange on the floor, resembling a dark liquid spill. Making the decision to enter the house, the police broke open the front door. What they saw inside shocked even the most experienced officers. The bodies of David and Lisa lay on the living room floor. Both had sustained multiple stab wounds. A few meters away, near the Christmas tree, they discovered Emily's body. She too had been killed with a knife, and her hands were clenched as if she had tried to defend herself. Jake was found in his room. The scene of his death was particularly brutal. It appeared he had tried to hide under the bed, but the killer had caught up with him. The house looked as if it had been hit by a storm. Broken decorations lay on the floor, furniture was overturned, and beneath the tree, among the presents, there were visible blood stains. Detectives, forensic experts, and crime scene investigators quickly arrived at the house. The initial examination confirmed that there had been no forced entry. All doors and windows were locked from the inside. This circumstance immediately raised suspicions that the perpetrator might have been familiar with the family or somehow gained access to the house before the murders began. Experts determined that the attack occurred around 1 o'clock in the morning. The murder weapon, a kitchen knife, was found on the kitchen floor. It had blood traces that presumably belonged to all 4 family members. Detectives immediately began developing theories. The motives could range from a robbery gone wrong to personal revenge. However, the lack of forced entry signs and the nature of the wounds indicated that the crime was likely carefully planned. The scene appeared chaotic, but didn't suggest spontaneous actions by the killer. Among the initial theories was also the thought that this might have been a family conflict that led to tragedy. But who could have committed such a brutal act? There were no answers yet, only more questions. News of the massacre quickly spread throughout the neighborhood. To the neighbors, the Whitaker family had been an example of prosperity. No one could imagine that something like this could happen in their home. However, detectives soon began finding their first clues, which shed light on the dark secrets hidden behind the facade of their perfect life. The Whitaker family murder case was assigned to detectives John Markson and Maria Rivera, veterans of the San Mateo County Homicide Division. They were called to the crime scene on the morning of December 25th, and from the first minutes, it was clear they were dealing with something unusual. The scale of brutality, lack of obvious motives, and absence of signs of forced entry led them to suspect this was a carefully planned crime. At the crime scene, experts confirmed that the front door and all windows were locked from the inside. The locks weren't damaged, which ruled out the possibility of forced entry. Moreover, the house's alarm system hadn't been activated, although the video surveillance system installed in the house continued to function. The retrieved camera footage showed that on the day of the murders, no one had entered or left the house after 10 o'clock p.m. This raised serious suspicions. The killer was either in the house before the cameras began recording events or used some other means of entry. Detectives began interviewing the nearest neighbors. Mrs. Jennings reported hearing strange sounds around 1 o'clock in the morning but thought they were fireworks. Several other people from surrounding houses mentioned seeing only the usual Christmas lights on the street that night, but nothing suspicious. No one noticed any suspicious vehicles or strangers, which made the investigation even more difficult. However, one neighbor living across the street remembered seeing David Whitaker about a week ago with an unknown man. They were discussing something near his car, and according to the witness, the conversation appeared tense. During interviews with David and Lisa's colleagues, detectives learned about Tom Harris, an employee at the same company where David worked. Harris, a financial analyst, had recently been fired after an internal investigation revealed significant violations in the company's operations. David, as department head, was one of the initiators of this investigation. Rumors that Harris had threatened David after his dismissal reached the police. Moreover, Harris himself, according to colleagues, had repeatedly said that this story isn't over for him yet. This made him the first serious suspect. Detectives brought Harris in for questioning. Tom appeared nervous, but not too frightened. He denied any connection to the murders and claimed he was at home with his family on the night of December 25th. However, his alibi proved shaky. No one except his wife could confirm his whereabouts. When examining his phone, police discovered he had called David 3 days before the murders. However, Harris explained this as wanting to discuss financial matters that, according to him, weren't yet resolved. His explanations didn't convince the detectives. They began checking his bank accounts, phone calls, and surveillance camera footage around his house. Despite initial suspicions about Harris, searches of his home and office yielded no evidence linking him to the crime. This forced detectives to return to other theories. One of these was the suggestion that the murders were connected not only to David's professional activities, but also to his personal life. As they delved into the Whitaker family's past, detectives began finding leads that indicated this tragedy might not have been random, but rather the result of carefully hidden secrets. The trail led them to mysterious correspondence that would soon change the entire course of the investigation. During detailed examination of the Whitaker family members' personal devices, forensic investigators discovered intriguing data. David's laptop contained traces of recently deleted files, which they managed to recover using special software. Among the recovered materials were encrypted messages sent from an unknown data exchange service. The content of these messages, even in partially decrypted form, indicated that David was involved in some illegal activity. Several phrases, such as net profit, transit through offshore accounts, and courier problem, immediately caught the detectives' attention. The investigation proceeded in close collaboration with cyber specialists, and soon they identified a key figure, an unknown correspondent who signed as X. X turned out to be the owner of an email account on an encrypted platform typically used to avoid surveillance. After lengthy analytical work, investigators discovered that X was connected to Victor Harrow, a criminal financier known in certain circles. Harrow had been implicated in several investigations related to international money laundering, but had successfully avoided charges until now. Further examination of the correspondence showed that David Whitaker had been in contact with Harrow for the past several years. The messages were full of references to financial transactions that apparently were part of an illegal scheme. This became a key moment in the investigation. An equally shocking discovery was that Lisa was also involved in this activity. Her bank accounts contained transfers to accounts in offshore zones, the origin of which couldn't be explained. Additionally, she actively used a corporate card registered to a shell company that police linked to Harrow. Detectives began constructing a theory. The Whitaker family, outwardly leading an ideal life, was actually engaged in money laundering. David, using his position in the company, possibly helped conceal illegal income, while Lisa was involved in creating the appearance of legitimate business activity. This explained their high standard of living, which didn't quite match their official income. Examination of financial documents from David's company revealed a whole chain of suspicious operations. The company's accounts were regularly used to transfer large sums to offshore accounts, and then the funds would return to a complex network of shell companies. David approved these schemes, covering them up in the accounting records. Lisa handled another side of the operation. She worked with fake suppliers, processed fictitious contracts, and coordinated activities through her contacts. Emily and Jake probably knew nothing about what was happening, but their deaths became collateral damage in an attempt to eliminate all witnesses. Further investigation also showed that in the months before the murders, David and Lisa had been actively discussing leaving the scheme. In their personal correspondence found on Lisa's phone, there were mentions that they wanted to start over. This clearly didn't suit their criminal partners. Perhaps the attempt to exit the scheme became the reason for the tragedy. Now detectives understood they were dealing with a professionally organized group for whom eliminating witnesses was standard practice. But who exactly was behind the murders? All evidence pointed to Victor Harrow and his criminal empire. However, fully uncovering the network would come in the next stages of the investigation. Detectives Markson and Rivera delved deeper into the investigation, focusing their efforts on uncovering Victor Harrow's identity. His name had surfaced in several previous international financial crime cases, but none had resulted in a conviction. Harrow was known for his caution and ability to hide his activities through complex legal structures and shell entities. Through cooperation with federal services, they established that Harrow used offshore accounts and networks of shell companies for money laundering. The connection to David Whitaker was confirmed through a series of financial transactions. Harrow likely hired executioners to eliminate the family after learning of their desire to exit the scheme. Federal services began an operation to dismantle Harrow's financial network, simultaneously providing detectives with data for further investigation of the murders. The operation revealed key participants, managers, lawyers, and intermediaries who helped Harrow maintain the appearance of legitimate business. It was obvious that his influence extended far beyond Hillsborough. However, the police's main attention was drawn to messages sent from a number connected to Harrow on the day of the murders. They contained instructions and details indicating preparation for the crime. This data became the basis for obtaining a warrant for Harrow's arrest. Analysis of financial documents confirmed that David and Lisa were actively involved in the scheme. Initially, they received commission for their services, but then their role grew, and they became key figures in one link of the chain. After witnessing the scale of the operations, they began to fear for their safety. Lisa, according to correspondence with David, insisted on ceasing participation in the schemes. David, in turn, warned that this could lead to dangerous consequences. These fears proved well-founded. Soon after their attempts to exit the network, Harrow began taking steps to eliminate them. At a certain point in the investigation, detectives returned to the figure of Tom Harris. He remained among the suspects since his conflict with David was well known. However, an unexpected turn occurred when police discovered that Harris had also tried to contact federal authorities to provide information about Harrow. Harris claimed he had become aware of details about the scheme and planned to expose it. This made him a potential target for elimination. Harris provided police with evidence of his claims, emails and phone call recordings with David discussing their shared concerns about Harrow. This finally cleared Harris of suspicion. Detectives and federal services proceeded to the final stage of the operation. Victor Harrow was arrested at a private villa in Southern California. During the search, documents were found directly indicating his involvement in the Whitaker murders. Among them was correspondence discussing the need to close the issue with the family. In addition to Harrow, several of his accomplices were arrested, including the murder executioners. They confessed to their actions, explaining that they were acting on orders to eliminate the risk of the scheme being exposed. There was sufficient evidence to build an indictment. The murder of the Whitaker family was solved thanks to the coordinated work of detectives and federal agents. Victor Harrow and his criminal network received their deserved punishment, but the tragedy left a deep mark on society. What seemed to be a perfect family became victims of the dark side of their activities. This case became a reminder of how easily external prosperity can hide dangerous secrets. Hillsborough took a long time to recover from the shock, and the Whitaker story became one of the most discussed in America's criminal chronicles.